And then you go for lunch, which is usually very welcome by that stage. And then in the afternoon, usually on the same day as the rest of the test has taken place, you do a speaking test. And the speaking test takes no more than 15 minutes. So what about the speaking test? Well, many people are a little bit worried about the speaking test because they feel that their English is not quite good enough. Let me say right now that in my experience over the last few years, most people can cope with the speaking test reasonably well. The question is, can you get the band score that you want? Well, obviously that remains to be seen. But let me tell you about the speaking test. The format of the speaking test changed in July 2001, which means that many of the books that are available in Yangon are now out of date. There are some books, however, which are up to date on the speaking test information. But I can tell you, for example, that the test is now in 3 parts: part 1, part 2, part 3. In part 1, the interviewer asks the candidate some very easy questions about himself or herself. Such questions as, what's your favourite colour? What was your favourite subject at school? What kind of food do you like? Do you cook? What kind of sports are popular in Myanmar? General questions like that. There's no reason at all why anyone should not be able to answer the questions in part 1. They are very general, very easy questions. This is Cambridge Practice Tests for IELTS, Volume 3, published in 2002. And it says, for example, that in Test 1, in the speaking test, in Part 1, you could have questions about your family. For example, do you have a large family or a small family? Can you tell me something about them? How much time do you manage to spend with members of your family? What sorts of things do you like to do together? Do you get on well with your family? If you do, why? If you don't, why not? In part 2, the examiner will give the candidate a topic to talk about for between 1 and 2 minutes. Before you start talking, you'll be given a minute to think about what you're going to say, and you get a piece of paper and a pencil to make some notes. You will not be allowed to take the paper and pencil or the cue card out of the examination room. Okay, that's for security purposes. But what will the topic be? Well, the topics in part 2 are usually fairly easy, fairly general kinds of topics. The point is to give you an opportunity to show the examiner what you can do in English. It's not trying to trap you. It's not trying to ask you questions that you couldn't possibly know the answer to. For example, tell me about life on an orbiting space station, or tell me about the problems of living in the Arctic, or something like that. That will be completely unreasonable. So part 2 will not include that kind of outlandish topic. Instead, you'll be asked to talk about something like your favourite restaurant, or a shop that you visit regularly, or a book that you've read that impressed you, or a movie that you've seen that impressed you, or about your best friend, or a piece of equipment that you use on a regular basis. All those kind of things are well within your experience, and you should be able to talk at length without having to pause and think about what you're saying for about 2 minutes. You could quite easily be asked to talk about something like this topic. Describe a teacher who has influenced you in your education. And then it gives you some suggestions. You should say where you met them, what subject they taught, what was special about them, and then the bottom line is the most important. Explain why this person influenced you so much. Remember, in part 2, your main task is to justify why you chose to talk about that particular teacher. In part 3 of the speaking test, the examiner will ask you some very general questions related to the general topic that you talked about in part 2. So, for example, if you were talking about a book, then you'll talk about books and reading. If you were talking about the news, you'll talk about news and the media and how important it is to people. And the things that you're expected to demonstrate in part 3 are your abilities to explain, to compare past time and present time, or your parents' generation and your generation, to evaluate something, how important is something, and to explain things, and to speculate about changes, possible changes in the future. So, for example, although many people don't yet have experience of the internet at the time I'm recording this, you could quite easily be asked to speculate about the importance of electronic media in the future, even in a country which is maybe developing more slowly than some other countries. But don't be put off by questions like that. They're perfectly reasonable. You can just imagine what will happen in the future. Because you've been talking about a teacher, you go on to talk about developments in education. For example, how has education changed in Myanmar in the last 10 years? What changes can you foresee in the future in the next 50 years? It's not so easy to answer, but you can guess. And talking about the expectations of today's school leavers compared with those of the previous generations. And asking possibly about such things as extracurricular activities. What role do you think they play in a child's education? And maybe some personal questions. For example, what method of learning works best for you? Do you prefer self-study? Do you prefer working with a study guide? Do you prefer working in a large class with lots of other people? Part 3 goes on for whatever time is left to make it up to about 14 minutes. And finally, the examiner will smile at you and say the welcome words, "Thank you very much, that's the end of the speaking test." And you'll be very glad to hear that, and you'll walk out of the room wondering what score you got. Of course, everybody does. Okay, to finish off, here is an example of a full-length speaking test.